Hi, everyone at home. We're here for another GAMSAT podcast. Today, we're going to be looking at what will the 2020 March GAMSAT look like. I'm Arshad again, and our guest today is, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Lauren. I'm generally in the Section 2 space. I do a little bit of student admin, and I'm also the student experience manager for Melbourne.
Awesome. So Lauren's going to be starting her first year of med next year. So she's going to be telling us a little bit about her past couple of GAMSAT sits, and I'm going to be giving a bit of my input, and we can think about the trends of the GAMSAT overall. We kind of discussed it a bit already at our pre-podcast brunch. What did you have at the brunch, Lauren?
I had these phenomenal zucchini and kale fritters, somewhat
Nice.
life-changing,
Nice.
and just a coffee to smite Arshad because he hates them.
Yeah, not a big fan of the coffee. I feel like a lot of people, once they hear that, they're going to be like, what? Is this dude even from Melbourne?
No, we
Cool.
know you're not human. You can't be.
Anyway, let's get straight into it, and yeah, just like give us your thoughts overall. I guess we'll do it chronologically because obviously that seems to make the most logical sense.
Yep.
We'll start off with section 1. Do you want to tell us a little bit about a couple of the recent GAMSATs and the overall trend that section 1 seems to be taking?
Yeah, so over the last year, we've had the March 2019 and the September 2019 taking a slightly different trajectory to where they were in previous years. I sat both the March 2018 and the September 2018. And some of the biggest fundamental differences that we've been noticing since then is that the length of the pieces tends to be increasing, firstly and foremostly. So we sort of have transitioned away potentially from some of the more the abstract pieces, the pieces that are really kind of esoteric and niche, stuff that kind of relates to philosophy or these really kind of heavy concepts that maybe art students would typically be sort of tackling with. And we've been moving towards things that are more accessible, but typically a lot longer.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's kind of adding a bit of this time pressure that we haven't seen as much in previous years to a greater extent, I should say, because time pressure's always been a factor.
Mm-hmm.
But now we may not have the same payoff for pieces will tend to be increasing. They might be a page and a half long for now 3 questions. So the payoff that we get with section 1 and this kind of increasing length is one of the biggest differences that we've noticed coming forward, firstly and foremostly in March 2019, but also to a certain extent in September as well.
Sweet. So the 2 interesting points you brought up there. The first one that I kind of want to probe on a bit and kind of get your thoughts on is you kind of mentioned that they're moving away from these more esoteric, highfalutin type texts, right? And it's interesting because I think it's been a year. I think it was around March 2018 that ASA changed their description of, I think it was section 1 of the GAMSAT as a whole, to mention that they're doing their best not to disadvantage second language English speakers, right? So that shift could come with that kind of it could be an implication of that particular phenomenon, that they don't want to bring these texts that are impossible to read, because again, they're not testing the level of English. Rather, what they're trying to test is, do you have these underlying skills, the ability to empathize with the author or work through the author's logic, so on and so forth. So do you want to maybe tell me a little bit more about now the fact that we've had this change to slightly less difficult to break down texts? How has that affected the way that we read texts and the way that we try to understand the underlying things that are actually being tested in the section 1 space as a whole?
I think it's a bit of almost a double-edged sword in the sense of what we're now reading in the stems and being able to understand and retain the information. As far as the structure and actually comprehending the material itself, it has become a little bit more accessible. Like we mentioned with making it more accessible to English as second language speakers. So we're noticing that the wording itself, it's not so much a literary analysis as it used to be. Moving away from, I remember there was some really whack works by like Jung and Freud and things that were just really kind of you spent a lot of time trying to understand what on earth was being described. And
the jargon of it.
Exactly. So they've moved away from that into language that's actually quite accessible in a sense. Like you can read it and it's straightforward, and although there might be sort of secondary meanings and things, it's more immediately obvious. But that's when the length of the pieces and the retention and the ability to actually hold large pieces of information and read a piece and sort of stay focused for that length of time becomes a bit more tedious, because the amount expected of you has increased vastly.
Awesome. So maybe to harp on that point a little bit more, with this change, what is maybe a change in the approach that the students could kind of start to think about to take that change into account? Thoughts?
Well, projecting forward into March 2020 a little bit, things that they, as far as we've picked up on from March 2019 and September 2019, it might be worthwhile to start to read longer texts and to actually practice retaining those vast amounts of information. And that's going to come differently for everyone, depending on how you read, what you're comfortable with, what your background is. But it might be worthwhile to start thinking about, ways of underlining and ways of actually making notes of things that you have to remember and to...
Annotation, key strategy.
Exactly.
Sweet. Yeah, one thing I've noticed quite a bit lately, just in terms of where Section 1 is trending, they have this tendency, even with the non-fictional texts, to attempt to test people's empathy. So it's kind of like, instead of bringing this really clear-cut, rigid text on euthanasia, they'd rather bring a doctor who's thinking about euthanasia, right? So then they're not going to ask these simple questions like, oh, what is euthanasia, etc., or like, questions that are almost directly taken from the passage. But they're gonna ask you if you're able to put yourself in the shoes of the doctor and empathize with the way that he relates to euthanasia. Maybe for example, he's a doctor from a conservative background, a conservative religious background, and he's been raised up to believe that euthanasia is incorrect, is not morally correct. And now he's struggling with the way that he relates to this broader phenomenon. So again, they're not just testing you by bringing this really rigid, scientific type journal text on euthanasia. They're rather testing something a bit more key to what they actually want. Because again, what is Section 1 primarily testing? It's testing your ability to logically reason, and then beyond that, empathetically reason. So that's the first point that I wanted to touch on, which I think you've broken down pretty amazingly, the idea of how the texts have changed in terms of these really jargonistic, complicated stuff. And we can even see that, another place you can see that is with the diagrams. They used, Section 1 doesn't test statistics anymore, right? When I first started teaching it, I think it was 5-6 years ago, you'd get bar graphs and charts and stuff like that. Now they're more testing the implications of graphs, etc. So again, that trend is quite apparent. But before I harbour on too long, let me direct the conversation back to you. So the second point I wanted to get to was, and I think you've touched on it already quite a bit, the length of the text, right? So as you mentioned, we're moving from these shorter texts, but 3/4 of a page for 5 questions, to 1.5 pages for 3 questions, whatever it is. How is that affected the way that students approach it? And then maybe you can add to that as to what changes would you recommend?
I think I learnt about the effect of these changes the hard way, because when I sat the GAMSAT initially, I had to do a resit because when I did Section 1, I missed the last 30 questions.
Half of the exam.
Literally virtually half of the exam. And this is coming from a background where I think I love reading, and it seemed pretty intuitive to me, this sort of style of work and study. And so I think students have to be increasingly judicious about how they allocate their time throughout the exam. You can't come in with a mentality that you're going to get 100% in a section like this, because it'll just be far too slow. You have, less than 1.5 minutes, according to the timing, to get each question. And when you've got 1.5 pages worth of text with 2 or 3 questions, the payoff there and ensuring that you're skimming the right meaning of the text, you know, as a whole as well, instead of honing in on particular areas, and ensuring you strike this balance between kind of directly addressing the questions versus reading the text as a whole to get a good understanding. Finding a balance that allows you to manage your time effectively can be challenging. And so transitioning towards sort of rigorous timed practice, I think, to actually simulate that environment and simulate the stress, and knowing when, okay, I've given this question a really good shot, potentially my time is better spent elsewhere, and just being managing your time well enough to actually complete the exam is kind of really important, especially for upcoming seasons, noticing these consistent trends.
Yeah, no, that's pretty great the way you've put it. There's a particular word that you used in what you just mentioned that I think summarizes everything that you said and that I was thinking pretty well, and that's the word judicious. I really like that word. It hits it on the head. Whenever I'm trying to explain this concept to a lot of my students, the word that I use, or the term that I use, just being from an economics background, is opportunity cost.
Yep.
It's like, by spending 3 minutes on this question to be certain that you're right, what are you sacrificing later on, right? I think try to stray away from the word certainty when it comes to the GAMSAT, because to be certain of your answer is going to take you way too long, right? But to use an analogy, to try and be certain, the patient might be dead by then, right? Like to go to such a deep extent and think about it so intensely. Rather, you have to take what's there and make the decision on the point, and then more often than not, it will be correct, depending on how you've practiced in other ways. But yeah, that's pretty solid in terms of section 1. So maybe just quickly to summarize the trends that we're looking at in terms of March 2020 for section 1. And obviously, just to preface this, with predictions, they are just predictions at the end of the day. ASA could take a completely different direction just for the heck of it, right? And I think one thing to point out quite importantly is you do have these macro trends, these shifts, but the underlying skills do stay the same. Just the way that they're tested might change. For example, like we mentioned, we're now having longer texts, or we're now having different types of passages, etc. But these underlying skills of logical reasoning, empathy, inference, evaluation, etc., which obviously we can't get into intensely right now, those are the things that have been tested for the last 10, 15 years in this exam. It's the way that they're tested. So maybe just in bullet point, do you want to summarize what your major predictions for section 1 in March 2020 would be?
So we should probably be looking, considering the past trends, at generally quite long texts with little sort of question payoff. The general level should be somewhat accessible, probably. We did notice in September 2019 there was a bit of a trend towards poetry as well. I sort of neglected to mention this, but March we sort of saw this introduction of medical ethics, and then September we brought in this kind of more abstract poetry mixed with these long, more accessible texts. And so there is the potential for ASA to somewhat make a blend of these two sort of STEM types, to have these like poetry or ethical dilemmas that are a little bit more abstract and require a little bit more sort of emotional intelligence to unpack, as well as those like logical reasoning skills. But generally erring towards longer question types, that you just need to be quite judicious in time management and factors.
I think that's a really good summary. I think the one thing that I'd add to that, just from what I've been looking at, again, there are no perfect predictions, but from what I've seen, I think the tend towards emotional reasoning and the decrease in logical reasoning is something that I've seen quite apparent. Like when I first started, again, it'd be something like 50 to 60 questions that were focused on like the pure logic, whereas these days that's kind of decreasing. Even with your non-fiction text, like I mentioned earlier, they'll bring it through the lens of through a lens that you have to emotionally reason. There's this really interesting question in the pink booklet, and spoilers for any of you who want to look at the pink booklet. If I feel a bit weird saying spoilers for the pink booklet, it's like it's not.
It's been out for
it's
enough
not infinite.
years now.
It's like you know you're a bit of a nerd if you're saying spoilers for Ace's GAMSAT pink booklet. So I just watched Star Wars the other day. I might drop a couple of spoilers right here as well.
Don't you dare! I'm gonna watch that.
Sweet. Anyway, there's one really interesting question, right? And I think it shows how they're trying to test emotional intelligence in the space of non-fiction based STEMs. What they have is they have a graph, right? And the graph shows the different opinions of people on the different political spectrum, right? And then the question that they ask, they don't ask what is the opinion of person X, right? That would just be pure logic, right? You have to break down the graph and you have to identify that. But rather they ask, what is the opinion of person Y on person X's thoughts, right? So you have to place yourself, emotionally you have to place yourself into the mind of person Y and think about how would they be seeing person X, right? Usually they kind of coax this in like a political basis, where it's kind of like maybe this person's slightly left wing and this person's slightly right wing. So they won't ask for the right wing person's view on gun control. Rather, they'll ask how does the left wing person feel about the way the right wing person relates to this. So you really have to place yourself in the feet of these people, in the shoes, not in the feet. That's a bit weird. Don't place yourself in anyone's feet unless you got that going with them, right?
Yeah,
but anyway,
always ask for permission.
Always ask for permission. A bit of a weird tangent, but yeah, that's one thing that I've seen, and that's one of my major predictions. But
it is that kind of like one step logically removed from, if you look at the summation of everything that's provided, they may ask for a deeper extent of extrapolation. And we have seen that trending towards, well, if you think about what ACE is looking for, they're looking for people that will potentially also make sympathetic doctors. So this makes sense that you can step outside your own personal lens, your personal biases, and you can sort of set those to the side and, sort of completely unsubjectively, you can sort of really take a deep dive into how someone else might be feeling in a particular scenario, and just ensuring that you're able to manipulate all of these sort of skills at once, the logical reasoning and taking into account a different frame of reference. So, it is trending towards that in a certain sense.
Beautiful. So I think that's a pretty good summation of section 1. We gave a few concise predictions, and hopefully that'll kind of guide a bit of your studying. But I think the most important thing to remember is the underlying skills stay the same or have stayed the same. And that is where you focus your studying. We do talk about those in some of our other podcasts. Have a look whenever you get the chance on the website, whatever it is. Let's move on to section 2, everyone's favorite section. What are your maybe before we go into your predictions, what did you see in the March, what did you see in the previous GAMSATs? What were your thoughts on it?
So 2019 seemed to be the year where ASA transitioned from, in previous years, they tend to have these really broad, abstract concepts, these kind of universal but intangible things, love, courage, freedom, things like these that, you can interpret as many ways as there are people on the planet. And they've tended towards introducing some topics that have a bit more context in like a societal aspect or a cultural aspect, where things like sort of tolerance or things with sort of that are politically charged, that actually have kind of a certain frame of reference that you do have to somewhat adhere to, rather than taking a really broad macroscopic interpretation. And to the greatest extent, we've seen sort of very, very specific prompts come in. Things like we had in March, we had sort of family size and population control. So we had that idea that's something that is kind of more specific. The general public may have a general opinion on it, but you wouldn't expect many people sitting the exam to be experts necessarily on something like that. And then in September, we had taxation as well, which again is something that is quite contextualized. You can't have there's not that there's only one correct interpretation, but there is a general understanding that the greater society adheres to in that sense. So we've had this kind of introduction of prompts that are more limited in scope. And we've also seen that kind of somewhat tempered with prompts that are a little bit more broad reaching. So ideally this might be a way that ASU is trying to potentially discriminate between students, because writing to a very specific prompt is a good way of assessing whether someone's on topic, for starters, because it takes a greater degree of sort of like logical reasoning to be able to write some of these really specific prompts. And to use your underlying skills and what you already know in a new context like that. But they're still allowing for some of the kind of the emotional intelligence coming through and some of these more broad, abstract sort of prompts that we're also seeing.
Beautiful. Yeah, I think I'd agree with you. I think that is like primarily the major trend that we've seen. And again, it's a bit of a weird trend because they literally say in the booklet that it's going to be an abstract noun. Is taxation an abstract noun? I don't know, maybe like we'll leave that one to them. But yeah, that is, again, one of the major trends that we've seen. And I think like with that trend, like what are the implications of it? How do we go about preparing? That's kind of like the main question that we want to ask ourselves. Because again, with something like freedom, like you mentioned, you can spin it as many ways as there are people on the earth, right? But with taxation, there's a little bit more of a box, a little bit more of you're a bit more confined with what you can do. There's still heaps of different directions you can take it in, different ways of talking relating to the phenomenon of taxation. But again, it's with freedom, you can spin it and connect it to something else. Whereas with taxation, to spin it and connect it to like a different theme, it becomes a little bit more difficult or a little bit more dangerous as well. So maybe to direct the conversation back to you, what would your major approach, tips, ways of tackling this slight change? Again, they only bring two themes, so the next two themes could be both abstract nouns again, or they could both be more specific contextual things. But overall, what would your approach be moving forward?
Considering, even though we've noticed a trend, we know ASA is really dynamic. And so ideally the way you want to study is a way that regardless of what sort of prompts they're going to be throwing at you, you want the underlying kind of methodology to serve you well, regardless of what turns up on the day. And so something like the ideas-based approach that we tend to talk about is something that is really transferable, despite whether you have a prompt that has sort of defined goalposts or if it is something really broad, because you can bring elements in from the ideas that are transferable across lots of different varieties of prompts. It's just a matter of practicing the ability to form the connections, the logical conclusions, that higher level thinking of forming a contention that is poignant and actually says something that's worthwhile and thought-provoking. And it's practicing those skills of being able to make a solid connection there, regardless of what the topic is, that will serve you really well, despite what prompts appear on the day.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's pretty much sums it perfectly. We've seen that even with the change in the prompt style from these more broader abstract nouns to things that are slightly more specific, contextual, the way that we've historically taught and the way we still do teach, which is the ideas-based approach, having these broader underlying ideas with a broad level of applicability, has worked across both of the different types. I'd say the one thing that I'd add to that in terms of maybe being prepared for things that are slightly more contextual is just having a slightly broader set of examples with your idea, right? So whatever ideas that you're studying, you'll have examples that come with that. Previously, we've had students that limited themselves to like 2 or 3 examples, and they could mold those examples to pretty much anything. With the trend moving towards things that are more contextually based, I'd say the one thing that you can do to prepare for that is having a few more examples in your bank, just to be on the safe side, right? Like, again, might as well be better safe than sorry, right?
Yeah.
The one other trend that I've seen that I wanted to add on which isn't as big a problem or as big an issue as the one that you mentioned. But I've seen with section 2 that the identifying the theme has become slightly harder over time. I remember back when I first started teaching, identifying the extent to identifying the theme was looking at the word that popped
Yeah.
up the most, right?
Yeah.
Unless it was and. The theme is not going to be conjunctions, all right? That would be a cool theme though. But anyway, it was just like, okay, the word courage popped up 4 times or 3 times. That's the theme.
Yeah.
Lately, it's been slightly more complex than that. So I think for students, I'd say taking into consideration understanding the individual quotes instead of just kind of superficially reading them and being like, the theme is X, making sure to take a little bit more time just to do that. Because again, I'd say it's a super easy task identifying the theme, but if you do get it wrong, you've pretty much just failed already.
So it is definitely becoming less of a word finding activity, just finding sort of the repetitive word across the prompts, and more kind of like the underlying theme as a whole, as more of a, each prompt will tend to come with their own sort of sub-themes and thematic ideas. And so it's about finding what underlying kind of theme associates and links all the prompts, which is trending towards being more difficult these days.
Yeah. Agreed. It has become slightly more complex to identify the theme. Again, I'd say it's probably on the day compared to section 3, section 1, and the actual writing of your essays, it probably is the least arduous task you're gonna come across. But it is the one thing that if you get it wrong, you've pretty much screwed up a whole section, right? So as easy as it is, just make sure to not get it wrong, because yeah, just like if you're off theme, it's a bad mark straight up. So maybe just to summarize quickly section 2, the 2 main trends that we've identified is firstly the shift from abstract nouns to things that are slightly more contextual. And I've seen that particularly in task A as well, right? But that's the first thing. So in this March 2020, be prepared for the abstract nouns because they can definitely bring it back to that. But also remember the slightly more contextual stuff, right? Like things like immigration and stuff like that. Like usually they wouldn't bring something like that. Usually maybe they'd bring something like travel or like even something even more abstract than that, right? Like I don't know what's a more abstract word for moving or exploration. Yeah, maybe they'd bring something like exploration. Now it can more so trend towards something like travel or immigration, right? So being prepared for those slightly more contextual themes, and I'd say the ideas-based approach works perfectly for that. The one way that you add to the ideas-based approach to prepare for this is by having a few more examples. And the second thing that we touched on was the thematic stuff, right? It's becoming slightly harder to identify the theme, but still not too difficult. Don't get it wrong. If you get it wrong, like honestly, there's not much we can do. Like I tell all of my students, I can teach you to write good essays, but if you identify the theme wrong on the day, that's your own fault, right?
It's kind of that thing, if I go into a coffee shop and ask for a coffee, regardless of what I get, if it's not a coffee, I'm going to be pretty miffed.
Yeah, exactly.
So ensuring it's on topic and...
Did you just say miffed? How old are you, 500?
Probably don't use that word in your essays.
Geez, mine, I just got miffed, all right? Anyway, back on track. Let's get to everyone's least or most favorite section, section 3. What are the trends we're seeing there, and or maybe even before we get to the trends, what did we see across the last few GAMSATs?
So in March 2019 and September 2019, we've tended towards the disciplines in section 3 being somewhat mixed. So previously, you might have noticed there were, had you sat the exam a few years ago, you might have noticed there were very discrete kind of questions. Something would fall clearly within the lines of, this is a physics-based question, or this is a biochem question. But as we've sort of moved forwards, we've noticed they've started to integrate these concepts and blur the lines a little bit. And if they haven't integrated them, they tend to appear now more so in a context that's kind of extrapolated from where you might have learnt if you have a background in science. you're probably well versed in things like human physiology, biology, stuff like that. So the way these overarching ideas are coming up is now in the context of things potentially like veterinary biology or, biochemistry, and sort of mixing disciplines, biophysics and stuff. So finding new kind of ways of bringing up these things that are considered prerequisite knowledge so that we haven't had the exposure that we might have previously had.
And to me, that makes perfect sense, right? They're trying to test something else in this exam, right? They're not trying to test memory or memorization. And it's almost kind of unfair if they bring things that would be directly from a subject that a science or biomed student would have done, because then the engineering student or the art student who's sitting in the exam, who's maybe has the skills that they're looking for at a higher level than the biomed student, is disadvantaged because the biomed student literally knows that information, right? So they don't even need to think about their skills. They just like answer based on the fact that they did this in that subject that they did, right? So that's the thing that they're trying to move away from. They're trying to move towards bringing things in like contexts that we haven't seen. Like I think it's Mo who mentions the example where they won't bring up a human heart. They'll bring up like some random toad with like
four-chambered,
something like that. Classic. I'm pretty sure it's Mo, but
weird recycling system, something you would have.
Exactly, right. And maybe it's almost kind of like with this heart, everything is inverted, right? So they're testing your ability to read the diagram, but if you're gonna read it by through the lens of the fact that you've memorized the human heart, then you're not going to be able to, inverting it in your head is going to be really confusing for you. But if you haven't memorized the anatomy of the human heart, rather you have understood the way that it functions, inverting it shouldn't be a problem at all, right? It's just like, okay, this is the opposite, I'll do X, Y, Z, I'll get to the correct answers. So that definitely seems to be a big trend. A lot of people have mentioned that as a primary direction. So with this whole shift, both in terms of bringing it up in different contexts, but also the mixing of the different disciplines, how do we go about preparing for this? What is the approach? We just be like, screw this, I'm going.
Pretty much. We party the night before until midnight, and then we just rock up and should be fine.
Good time.
No, look, there's definitely a time and a place for the prerequisite knowledge. So if there are areas that are lacking or weaknesses that you have identified, it is a good idea to go back and to home in on those a little bit. Purely from the position that they're going to serve you well to contextualize a little bit what you're doing, to help you sort of access the correct logic that's required to actually, deal with the stems and come across to be able to sift through the information that is relevant to a question of that nature. So it will help to orient you in the sense that when you get a prompt, the prerequisite knowledge will comfort you that this is something I have dealt with in other contexts and that I have a general understanding of, but it shouldn't be used necessarily as a crutch to then prohibit you from actually assessing what's important in the stems, because they are evolving a little bit. We've also noticed that they tend towards using sort of like tabulated data, graphs, weird axes, sort of things that are very scientifically like sort of from science journals and stuff like that. And so if you bring in the previous experience of having accessed those and using your understanding to digest a scientific journal, you're probably erring towards the right track as far as the trends that we've noticed. So it's more about harnessing the prerequisite knowledge than as a springboard for the logic that you need to really crack into the questions in this kind of like alien context.
Yeah, awesome. One thing that I'll add, and I'm not the biggest Section 3 dude myself, but it's like you mentioned, right? These underlying skills, they stayed the same, but now they're trying to test them in different contexts, right? And like one thing that I always tell a lot of students, especially the younger students who come in with this mindset that, I did first year bio, first year chem, year 12 physics, I'm gonna get a 70, I'll be fine, right? That's not true, right? It's one way that I like to kind of put it is knowing those three things is the equivalent of being able to speak English for section 1.
Yes.
It doesn't make you good. All it does is it allows you to understand what's going on, right? It's like if you watch cricket and you don't know any of the rules, then you're just not even going to understand what's going on. But if you understand the rules, it doesn't make you good at cricket. I'm telling my life story right here. It's like my dad is looking at me like, oh shit, you suck at cricket. Like, rip. But anyway, I'm broken inside. Let's get back to the serious stuff. It's the language of section 3, right?
Yeah.
The stuff that they're testing are these underlying skills. And obviously you first need to learn the language. So if you're coming from like an arts background and you don't know anything about science, before you can start thinking about the skills, you obviously have to learn the information. If you haven't done physics ever, before you start thinking about the skills, you have to start thinking about the information, right? So that is the first step, but that is only the first step, right? Beyond that, the underlying logic, the processes of thinking is what's most important. And one thing that I've seen with a few students in section 3, I've seen them do it, and I've thought it's worked for them pretty well, is especially at the early stages of their studying, coming up with workflows or processes of thinking. So they do a question, they get the right answer. In their notes, they ask themselves, what were the different steps that I took to get to this correct answer, right? And then replicating that as they go. And then at a certain point by February or whatever, that thing just becomes as part of your subconscious, right? You don't have to think step 1, step 2, step 3. You just it just naturally happens. You do it, you get the correct answer. But anyway, you've identified these trends, the direction that it's going. What are some of your tips, approaches for how to deal with this particular shift?
When I came to studying, I found it really quite frustrating because I think a lot of perhaps some of the practice materials out there provided by ASA, they don't necessarily capture the true extent of the kind of extrapolation or the logical inferences that you have to make. They're sort of squared more soundly within the sort of like discrete section space. Like, you'll be able to find a question that is physics based on the practice exams, which is slightly disheartening because it's not as reflective of potentially what the exam will be like. So if you have means or access to things such as scientific journals and graphs, and being able to put two graphs side by side in the context of like a related subject with different axes, with different weird, random, things you might not necessarily see in a textbook going on. There's probably an understanding and learning how to extrapolate information of those. That would probably set you up really well. We've also noticed a bit more of a trend towards the need for speed, and especially in the context of like mathematics, that tends to be coming up a fair bit, like the ability across all of the disciplines, as we're talking now about biophysics, about chemistry, kind of all merging and coming together. And frequently you do need those mathematical skills to quickly manipulate in the time that you have per question to add on, what do I have to do? What do I have to, what sort of logical process do I have to come to? But then also completing calculations in that time that can start to chew up your time and your accuracy as well. So might be worthwhile kind of taking out those old maths textbooks and just refreshing some of those skills. But aside from that, just honing the timing aspect as well, because we are noticing similar to section 1, the stems are increasing in length, and being able to discern what sort of information is relevant to the question sets that you're given. Because there's that aspect of, you could read through the entire question, aim for precision, aim for every piece of information, and you could miss out on, that sort of that time payoff aspect that we were talking about, that there might be questions further down the track that also have the same breadth of information given, and you have to sort of wade through all of that in the time that you have remaining. Yeah. So
perfect, sweet. I think that summarizes it pretty concisely. So with section 3, maybe just to go over it in bullet form again, shifting the context that questions come in so that it's not something we would have seen in our biomed science degrees, things that are slightly more unfamiliar, right? So that they can test the underlying skills. Then I think the second and probably the most, the major one is the merging of the different disciplines
Yeah.
and how that affects the way we read and relate to STEMs. And then obviously you talked about the length, so on and so forth, how to strategize for longer STEMs. And I even think like little things like in your studying period, especially in the earlier days when you're studying, when you get a correct answer, ask yourself, how did I get that correct answer? Is there a faster, more accurate way to getting that correct answer, right? And then maybe if there is, embed that in your learning, right? Because maybe you got the correct answer, but it took you 2.5 minutes, whereas there's a method to do it in 1 minute, right? Those little things, especially in December, we're finishing off with December,
Yeah.
Jan, like I'd say up until mid to late Jan, you can still focus on those kind of things, asking yourself these questions, critically analyzing yourself. And then hopefully by Feb, you're spending more time just purely focused on the application. But it's important to be thinking about these things as you move forward, because there's a whole different array of factors that they're testing, right? And timing is a big element of that. Anyway, do you have anything else to add for section 3?
Oh, not particularly for section 3, apart from just being judicious, my favourite word. And
The old Judatron.
it is early enough in the season that, you know, you can adapt to new ways of thinking, and even learning from your peers might be really valuable at this point, because everyone brings forward their different own way of logic, like reasoning through a problem.
Yeah, definitely. And whether you're studying at home or studying with us, whatever it is, the way that we break up the course is into 3 bits, right? The first bit is, or the first component is where we test these, we understand the underlying skills, the underlying content as well. So it's like, this is the point where we're not just doing the question, but we're thinking about multiple pathways, right? And we still do that up until Jan 18th, right? The second component of the course, where we start from, where we go into late Jan, February, we're more focused on application. Questions, how can I do these questions? How can I understand these questions? The direction, and then finally in the last month, thinking about simulation, thinking about the mock exam, so on and so forth. So whether you're studying with us or you're studying at home by yourself, following that pattern of progression is really important. You don't want to just be doing questions at the beginning and not thinking about them, but at the same time, if you're doing theory in late Feb, it's probably a bit late, right? So breaking it up in that fashion we've found is the best method for progression, and hopefully it helps with your timelining as well. So maybe just to finish off, general thoughts on March 2020, how should students feel about their approach, and maybe just some general advice on how to feel about the GAMSAT as a whole.
Well, I think ASA really relishes in being able to be dynamic and to kind of maintain this shroud of mystery. So just please keep in mind that everything we say here we've just observed from years of sort of observation. Ultimately, they could sort of provide you with anything on the day. But having said that, there are sort of consistent study methods and approaches that tend to serve you well regardless of what they serve up, and tending towards always trying to learn for the sake of learning, for the sort of like the logical component, the way of thinking, rather than rote learning anything, regardless of whether that's for section 2, for sort of the content you're going to deliver, or section 3, sort of the discrete disciplines of physics and chem. Finding ways of applying those is kind of infinitely useful regardless of what kind of emerges on the day. And just consistency as always.
I think that's really important. Just maybe to finish off on a lesson in terms of how you want to go about studying, and it kind of goes back to the conversation we're having over brunch. Laura and I were talking about, you get these people, right, who they don't even know what the GAMSAT is, or they haven't looked at it at all. And then just like the day before the exam, they're like, yo, dude, what are the 3 different sections? And then they go the next day and they smash it out. They get a crazy good mark, right? And again, like, good on them. There are very few of those people. A lot of people, most people need to do study, probably need to sit the exam multiple times. But the discussion we were having is, what makes those individuals? Like, why can't they just go the next day and smash it out? And the conclusion that we came to was, it's the way that they've been thinking and studying their whole life. They're not used to, or the way that they've thought about and studied in high school and their undergrad is not by memorizing stuff, but rather by understanding things. And almost once they've understood a thing, forgetting about it, and then the next time that it comes, relearning it on the spot because they've understood how to understand that thing, if that makes sense, right? And I think with the 3 months that we have, I'm pretty sure almost all of us are not going to be that person who just goes the next morning and smashes it out. But what we can learn from them is we need to take a step back from information and start to think about analysis, skills, understanding, evaluation, so on and so forth, which is the way that we go with the GAMSAT and the way that we kind of study for it. And if you, again, like I'd say, if you think about it like that, the predictions don't even matter, because it could be the exact opposite of what we predict and you'd still get a good mark, and it could be exactly what we predict and you'd still get a good mark. So the method of study is what's most important, and the predictions, hopefully they'll add levels of how you guide that, so that overall things become a bit easier for you in the 2 to 3 to 4 month period. Anyway, I've been talking quite a lot. Thanks for tuning in, everyone. Is that the phrase to use? Tuning in. I feel a bit like New York Times-ish. Anyway, thanks for tuning in, everyone. Hopefully that was all really helpful. We'll see you in the next episode. Happy New Year's to everyone. We're recording this on the 31st.
New Year's Eve.
Yeah, New Year's Eve.
I get to start off my new year with Arshad. How exciting.
That's fun. That's cute. Sweet. Do you have anything to say, Lauren? Just a bye or a good luck to them?
Mostly good luck. I understand what this time must feel like. Do take some time out, especially around the holidays. Sanity first and foremost. It is a long season yet, but the beauty in that is there's plenty of time to sort of adapt your study methods and trial what works and find where you're most comfortable within the GAMSAT space.
Beautiful. Thanks, guys. See you next time.
See ya.
Bye.